The third morning after the funeral, in the long grey study at Wellesmere Hall, Clara Fenn knelt on the floorboards with a mouthful of pins and understood that she was being watched by a room full of people who had already decided what she was. She had come to take down the mourning drapery. That was the whole of her commission, agreed with the housekeeper in writing, at a rate of 2 shillings the day. The black crepe had hung 6 weeks over the study windows, and the fabric had gone stiff at the folds where the damp had reached it. Clara worked with her sleeves pushed back and her hair pinned up in the plain style of a woman who dressed for the work and not for the room. And behind her in the doorway, the family of the late Earl of Wellesmere stood arranged like figures on a mantel. "The sewing woman," said Lady Prudence Marchbank. "And she said it the way one says the name of a chair. I did not know we were keeping one." Clara did not turn. She had learned, in 7 years of going into other people's houses with her needlecase, that turning was what they wanted. She drew a pin from her mouth and set it in the cushion, at her wrist. Behind Lady Prudence stood a man Clara had not yet been introduced to, and would not be, because seamstresses were not introduced. He was tall and he was very still, and he had been standing in that doorway rather longer than the conversation required. Clara felt the weight of his attention the way one feels a window opened somewhere in a cold house. She did not look up. Her hand, drawing the crepe down from its rod, was perfectly steady, and her pulse was not. 2 shillings the day," Lady Prudence said to no one. "For a woman to pull cloth off a stick." The crepe came away in Clara's arms, and the light came into the study for the first time since October, and it fell across the paneling of the east wall. And Clara saw, quite clearly, that one of the panels did not sit flush with its neighbors. She did not mention it. She folded the crepe. She had no notion that morning that the seam of light along that panel would end by deciding who in England was a countess and who was not. The dead man was Edward, 6th Earl of Wellesmere, and he had died in November of a fever taken on the road from Bath, and he had left behind him a scandal that the county had been chewing for a month without arriving at the bone of it. He had married, everyone agreed he had married, he had told his steward he had married, he had written to his brother once, in a hand made loose by fever, and used the word wife. The difficulty was that no one could find the marriage. There was no entry in any parish register. The family solicitor had thought to search. There was no license lodged. There was no settlement drawn. There was a woman living in 3 rooms above a milliner's shop in the town of Kestwick, 4 miles off, who called herself Charlotte, Countess of Wellesmere, and who had a plain gold ring and a memory, and nothing whatever else, and there was a family at the Hall who called her something considerably shorter. Clara had sewn for Charlotte twice before the funeral. A grey merino gown, turned and retrimmed. Clara had noticed the woman's hands, which were not a lady's hands, and her carriage, which was, and had drawn no conclusions because Clara was paid to draw hems. The claimant, Lady Prudence called her, in the study that morning, and the word went out of the doorway and down the corridor and into the servants' hall by noon, because that is how a word travels in a great house. The claimant is writing again. To the bishop, this time. Clara folded the second length of crepe. She kept her eyes on the fabric. She was aware, without turning, of exactly where the tall man stood in the doorway, and of the moment he stopped standing there. That evening the housekeeper, Mrs. Orme, told her who he had been. "That is his lordship, Mrs. Brede," Orme said, setting down a plate of bread and cold mutton at the deal table in the still room. "The 7th Earl now. God help him, Julian. He came up from the regiment in November, and he has not slept since, by the look of him." "He was in the doorway a long while," Clara said. Mrs. Orme, who was 61 years old and had been at the Hall since she was 14, gave her a look over the rim of a teacup. "He was." Clara ate her bread. She did not ask anything further, because the asking would have been a kind of hoping. And Clara had made a settled arrangement with Hope some years ago, the terms of which were that they would not trouble one another. She was 26. Her father had been a linen draper in Kestwick, with a good hand for figures and a bad one for credit. and he had died, owing £400 to a wine merchant and a coal factor and the man who had held the lease on the shop, and Clara had paid it. It had taken her 6 years. She had paid it with her needle, in other people's houses, at 2 shillings the day, and she had paid the last £11 of it in September, and there had been no one to tell. That was the wound, and it was not the debt. The debt had been arithmetic. The wound was the shape her life had taken while she was doing the arithmetic, which was the shape of a woman that a room does not see. She had gone into 40 houses in this county. She knew the drawing rooms of half the gentry within 20 miles, knew where the damp came in, knew which ladies bit their nails under their gloves, and not one of those houses could have named her. She was the sewing woman. She had been the sewing woman so long that she had stopped, somewhere around her 24th year, expecting to be anything else, and the stopping had been so gradual that she had not felt it happen. The panel was on her mind all that night, in the narrow bed under the eaves that the hall gave to tradespeople staying over. She went back to the study at 7 the next morning before the family stirred, on the pretext of the rods. The panel was oak, in the linen fold pattern of a piece with the wall from the wainscot to the picture rail. It sat perhaps 1/8 of an inch proud along its left edge. Clara ran her thumb down the seam. A joiner's work gone wrong would swell at the middle where the grain moved. This was proud, along its whole length, evenly, the way a thing is proud when it has been taken out and put back by hands that were in a hurry. She pressed the panel's upper left corner. Nothing. She pressed the lower right, and the whole face of it swung 1/2 inch out on a hidden pin, and stopped, and would not come further, and there was a smell of old paper and cold plaster. Miss Fenn, she did not startle. That was the thing she noticed about herself afterwards, that she did not startle, though her heart had gone up into her throat, and stayed there. The Earl of Wellesmere was standing in the study door in his shirt-sleeves, with a candle he had not needed, because the sun was up, and his face was the face of a man who had been awake since 3. He was 34. He had dark hair cut short in the way of the regiment and a scar of about 1 inch through his right eyebrow. And he had the stillness Clara had felt through the back of her neck the morning before, and now she was looking at it directly. Clara took her hand off the panel. "There is a fault in the wall, my lord," she said. He crossed the room. He did not hurry. He stopped at a distance that was entirely correct and did not feel it, and he looked at the panel, and then he looked at her hand, which was still raised a little, as though the wall might be asked something. "Show me," he said. His voice was low and level, and it was not a request in the grammatical sense. Clara found, with some irritation, that her hand had already moved to the corner before her mind had ruled on the matter. She pressed. The panel swung its 1/2 inch. He put his own hand flat against it and pushed, and the pin gave with a sound like a knuckle cracking, and the panel came away entire, and there was a hollow behind it the size of a hat box. There was a japanned tin in the hollow, there was a bundle of letters tied with tape, and there was a small book, bound in green calf, with a rubbed patch on the cover where a thumb had lived for years. The Earl did not touch any of it. He stood looking into the hollow with his jaw set, and the muscle at the corner of it moved once, and Clara, who read bodies for a living because bodies are what she fitted cloth to, saw a man decide not to say something. "You will say nothing of this," he said. "No, my lord, to anyone." I said, "No, my lord." He looked at her then properly for the first time. Something went across his face and was gone before it could be named. "Yes," he said, "you did." He took the green book from the hollow and put it inside his coat, which was over his arm, and he left the letters and the tin where they were, and he replaced the panel, and he went out. He did not thank her. Clara stood a while in the study with the light coming in through the windows she had stripped, and her hands were shaking, and she made them stop, and she went and found her needle case because there were 3 shirts to turn before dinner, and the world had not stopped merely because a wall had opened. You will want to know what was in the book. She wanted to know as well. Stay with her. She will find out, and so will you, and the finding will cost her something. For 11 days after, the Earl of Wellesmere was cold to her in a way that Clara found she could describe with some precision because she catalogued it. He was cold in the corridor on the Tuesday, when he passed her carrying an armful of linen and said, "That is too much for one trip," and took half of it and carried it to the linen room himself, and set it down and left without a word, and she stood there with her arms unaccountably light and her face unaccountably warm. He was cold in the yard on the Thursday when the rain came on and she was crossing from the still room, and he said, "Go inside," in a voice like a door closing, and she went inside, and she watched from the window as he stood in the rain another 4 minutes doing nothing at all. He was cold at the dinner she was not at on the Saturday when Mrs. Moss. Orme reported that his lordship had asked, apropos of nothing, whether the woman doing the sewing was being fed properly, and Lady Prudence had said, "The sewing woman is fed exactly as the sewing woman is always fed," and his lordship had said nothing, and had not eaten his fish. Clara took each of these, turned it over, and put it away, and the message she attached to each of them was the message her wound supplied, which was that a decent man is decent to furniture as well, and it means nothing, and a woman who believes otherwise at 26 deserves what she gets. Her hands knew better. Her hands, at the sound of his boot in a passage, would put down whatever they were holding and go still. On the 12th day, Charlotte came to the hall. She came on foot, 4 miles from Kestwick, in the grey merino gown. Clara had turned, with mud to the knee of it, and her chin up, and she asked at the front door for the Earl of Wellesmere, and the footman put her in the small drawing-room because he did not know what else to do with a woman who might be a countess and might be nothing. Clara was in the small drawing-room. She was on her knees under the window with a length of green damask pinning a valance, and she was invisible, as she generally was, and so she heard all of it. "You may sit," said Lady Prudence. "I will stand," said Charlotte. "As you please." A rustle. A fan opened. "You have written to the bishop." "I have." "The claimant writes to a bishop." Lady Prudence said it to the room, to the ceiling, to the ranks of the county assembled in her imagination. "You understand that you are making yourself ridiculous. There is no register. There is no license. There is a ring, which any woman may buy, and there is a word from a man in a fever, which any lawyer will tell you is worth precisely nothing. And there is you, in a gown that has been turned." Clara's hand stopped on the pins. "He married me in September," Charlotte said. Her voice was not loud. "At St. Aldhelm's, in Bath by license, on the 14th. There was a curate and a clerk and my aunt. He said he would lodge the papers when he came north. He did not come north for 6 weeks, and when he came he was ill. St. Aldhelm's has no such entry. My solicitor has been. Then it was not entered. Then it did not happen." There was a silence in which Clara heard the fire move. "You are a milliner's assistant," said Lady Prudence gently, and the gentleness was the worst of it. "My brother-in-law was fond of you. Men are fond of such women. Go home, and I will see that you have £30 a year, and we will call you Miss Vane again, and no one will ever say the word claimant in your hearing. And that is more mercy than you are owed." Clara stood up. She had not decided to. Her knees were stiff, and there were pins in her mouth, and a fold of green damask over her arm, and she stood up out of the shadow of the window like a piece of the furniture declining to be furniture any longer, and both women turned. "Madam," Clara said, and it came out level. "On the 14th of September, I was in Bath. I delivered a bonnet to Miss Vane at her aunt's house in Bladode Buildings at 9 in the morning, and she was dressed for a wedding, and her aunt was crying, and I have the entry in my day book, and the bonnet cost £1.06. The fan stopped. "You are the sewing woman," Lady Prudence said. "Yes, madam." "And you propose to give evidence." "I propose to say what I saw." "You may call it what you like." She said it quite quietly, and afterwards lying awake under the eaves. What frightened her was not that she had said it, but the arithmetic she had done in the 2 seconds before she stood. She had known what it would cost. 40 houses in this county, and every one of them within reach of that fan. She had stood up anyway, because a woman was being told that her marriage had not happened by people who had not been there, and Clara had been there, and there was no version of herself that could kneel under a window and let that pass. She had not known that the door to the corridor had been standing open. She had not known that the Earl of Wellesmere had been in the corridor for the whole of it, and that he had not come in. The commission ended on the Friday. The housekeeper was miserable about it. 2 more days of work remained, and Mrs. Orme found herself explaining in a voice she could not keep steady that her ladyship had determined the drapery could be finished by the housemates. Clara packed her needle case. She had expected it. She packed it in the order she always packed it, because there was an order, and it had been her father's order in the shop before it had been hers, and it ran so: the shears in the roll, the cushion in the tin, the papers of pins by size, the tape measure coiled and not folded, because folding puts a memory in the linen, and a tape with a memory in it is a tape that lies. It took 4 minutes. It had taken 4 minutes in 40 houses. She was calculating while she did it, with the part of her mind that had paid £400 in 6 years. The Marchbanks were at Wellesmere. The Lestranges were at Coombe. Lady Prudence dined with the rectory, the hall and Coombe, in a rotation that Clara could have drawn from memory because she had been under the windows for all of it. And every one of those tables had ladies at it who sent for her twice a year for turning and trimming. And not one of them would send again after Lady Prudence had said, "Over the fish." What, in that gentle voice, that the sewing woman had taken to giving evidence. 12 houses would close by Michaelmas. Perhaps 18. She had put the last £11 of her father's debt into a wine merchant's hand in September, and had walked out into the street. A free woman for the first time in 6 years, and she had not told anybody. And she had gone home and eaten a boiled egg. 5 months of freedom. Then a fold of green damask, and a fan, and a woman standing in a room, being told she had not been married. She did the sum twice on the walk down from the eaves. It came out the same. It had come out the same in the drawing-room, in the 2 seconds, before she stood, which was the part that frightened her. Mrs. Orme put a hand on her arm at the still-room door. "It was not right," she said. "What she said to you." "It was not right, and I have been here 47 years, and I know the difference." "Thank you," Clara said. "You will come Sunday to me. I mean, there is a fire in my room, and I am not gentry, and I may have who I like." Clara found she could not answer, and nodded instead. She walked the 4 miles to Keswick with her case in her hand and the light going, and at the turn by the milestone the Earl of Wellesmere was standing with his horse. He had been waiting some time. The horse was cold. "Miss Fenn," she stopped in the road. Her heart did the thing it had been doing for a fortnight, and she ignored it. "My lord, you are dismissed." "I am." "For the thing you said in the drawing-room, for standing up in it." "I think, my lord, the saying was secondary. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, and did not become anything." He looked down the road toward Keswick, and then he looked back at her, and he said, in the level voice, "Walk with me." They walked. He led the horse. For a 1/4 mile he said nothing at all, and Clara let him have the silence because she had spent her life in rooms where the person of consequence was working up to a thing, and she knew what it looked like. "My brother's diary," he said at last, "was in the wall." Clara said nothing. He kept one from the year he was 15. Our father found the first and burned it, and told him it was a girl's habit, and Edward kept them after that in a hollow behind the paneling of the study, which our grandfather had put there for something. And my father never knew, and I did, because I was 9 and I followed him. His voice did not change at all. I had forgotten it existed. I had 40 men's letters to write in November, and I stood in that study every day for 6 weeks, and I did not remember, until a woman with a mouthful of pins put her thumb on the seam. "Was it there? What she says?" "The 14th of September, he said, St. Aldhelm's. The curate's name is Hollis." The clerk was ill, and a substitute took the register, and Edward wrote that he would go back in October to see it entered properly, because the substitute's hand was poor. He stopped in the road. He never went back. There is no entry, because a sick clerk was replaced by a fool, and my brother died before he could correct it, and Charlotte Vane has been called a liar in 3 counties for 4 months because of a clerk. Then "It is finished," Clara said. "You have the book. You give it to the bishop. A diary is not a register." Clara stopped too. She saw it. Then the whole shape of it, the way she saw the shape of a gown from a flat length of cloth. "The substitute clerk," she said. "He wrote something. If he took the service, he wrote it somewhere, on a paper, in a book, in his own house. Clerks are not solicitors. They do not lodge. They keep." The Earl of Wellesmere looked at her for a long moment in the failing light on the Kestwick road, with his horse breathing behind him. "Yes," he said. And then, after a moment, not levelly at all, "Clara, it was the first time." She had been Miss Fenn, and the sewing woman, and the woman doing the sewing, and she had been those things for 11 days in his mouth, and now she was not, and the sound of it went through her ribs like a hand. She did not answer. She could not have. He seemed to understand that, because he began walking again, and she walked beside him, and neither of them said anything for the remaining mile and a half, and it was the loudest silence of her life. At the edge of Kestwick he stopped and gave her the reins to hold while he did nothing with his hands at all, and then he took them back. "I will find the clerk," he said. "You will need to know Bath. I know Bath. You will need to know which house in Bladud Buildings, and which curate, and what the aunt's name is, and you will need someone to walk into the room and be recognized." He was quiet. "You're asking to come," he said. "I am telling you what the thing requires. My lord, you may take it, or leave it." The muscle in his jaw moved. "Tuesday," he said. "The mail coach at 6. I will pay for the inside seat." "You will not," said Clara, and turned and went up the street to her rooms with her needle case and her heart going like a bird in a box, and did not look back, and knew, without looking, exactly how long he stood in the road. She found out later that it was 11 minutes. They went to Bath, and it took 9 days, and it was not romantic in any way that Clara could have explained to anyone. They found the curate Hollis on the second day, in a damp lodging in Walcott, with 3 children and a chest cold. He came to the door in a coat with the nap gone off the elbows, and he did not know who the Earl of Wellesmere was, and did not much care, and he sat them down among the children and coughed into a handkerchief, and remembered the wedding at once. "September," he said. "The 14th. I remember because the bride's aunt brought a cake and there was no one to eat it. 4 persons in the church and a cake for 20. He looked into the middle distance. He held her hand through the whole of it. Most of them do not. Most of them stand a foot apart and say the words at me. "The clerk," said the Earl. "Old Sanderson had the quinsy. They sent up a man from the vestry for the fortnight." "His name?" The curate coughed for some while. One of the children, a girl of about 5, came and stood against Clara's knee and looked up at her. And Clara, without thinking about it, straightened the child's collar, which had been put on crooked. "I never had it," Hollis said at last. "I am sorry. He was a heavy man with a bad wig, and he wrote like a spider. I told him twice to take more care over the entry, and he told me twice that he had been keeping books since before I was breeched." Out in the street the Earl of Wellesmere stood a moment with his hat in his hand. He held her hand through the whole of it, he said, to no one in particular, and put his hat on, and said nothing else, for 2 streets. They found the aunt on the 3rd day in Bladud Buildings, in a front parlor with the shutters half closed. She was a small woman named Mrs. Butter. Dean and she wept before Clara had finished her first sentence, and she wept because she had been telling the truth for 4 months to people who had looked at her the way one looks at a woman who is lying. And here at last were 2 persons in her parlor, who had come to hear it. She remembered the cake, she remembered the bonnet, and she remembered Clara. And she took Clara's hand in both of hers and said, "You set the ribbon." She had done it herself, and it sat wrong, and she would not have known. And you set it, and you never said a word to her about it having been wrong. Clara had no memory of it whatever. She had set 10,000 ribbons. The aunt gave them nothing they did not have. She gave them the day, and the church, and the cake, and the tears, and no name, because she had spent the morning of the 14th of September looking at her niece, and not at a heavy man in a bad wig, as anyone would. On the 4th day, Lady Prudence's solicitor arrived in Bath, which told Clara something about how afraid the Hall had become. And on the 5th day, the parish clerk of St. Aldhelm's, a small, worried man named Pettifer, informed them that the substitute had been a person engaged from the vestry for a fortnight in September, and that the vestry's own book of that fortnight had been sent for binding, and had not come back. "Sent where?" said the Earl. "I could not say, my lord." "Sent by whom?" "Mr." Pettifer looked at the floor and said that a gentleman had called in December and had been most helpful about the parish's books, and had arranged the binding himself at his own expense and had been very well dressed. Clara watched the Earl of Wellesmere's face and saw nothing on it at all, and understood, from the nothing, that he was angrier than she had ever seen a man be. They walked out into the rain in Abbey Green. "She has had it burned," Clara said. "She has had it bound," said the Earl. "Prudence does not burn things. Burning is a confession. She has had it bound, and it will be sitting in a bindery in this city, and it will come back in 18 months, with excellent boards, and 1 fortnight of leaves missing, and the man who did it will believe he was performing a service for a very well-dressed gentleman. Then we find the bindery. There are 9 binderies in Bath, and I have been given no authority in this parish, and I am a stranger with a title, and no warrant, and every one of those 9 men will tell me to apply to the vestry, which is exactly what the very well-dressed gentleman was counting on." The rain came down on Abbey Green. Clara stood in it and thought, and what she thought about was not law. "They will not tell you," she said. "They will tell me." He turned. "A bindery has a woman in it," Clara said. "Or a wife over the shop, or a girl who sews the sections. Do you know who sews a book, my lord? The signatures are stitched. It is needlework. It has always been needlework, and it has always been women. And there is not a binder's shop in England where the sewing is not done by a woman in a back room, and she will not tell a strange earl anything, and she will tell me everything, because I will sit down and take up a needle and ask her what thread she uses." The Earl of Wellesmere stood in the rain in Abbey Green and looked at her with an expression Clara had never had directed at her by any person in her life. And she had to look away from it. 9 shops, he said. "I will want a day and a half." It took 2 days. The first 6 shops gave her nothing, and they gave her nothing pleasantly. She went in at the front like a customer, and asked about the rebacking of a prayer book, and was passed, in every case, to a back room, because the front of a bindery is boards and glue, and the back of it is thread. She drank 6 cups of tea. She learned that the trade in Bath was bad that spring, that a man in Milsom Street had gone under, owing everybody, and that the master of the 4th shop beat his apprentice, which the woman sewing his sections told Clara in a flat voice while pulling a linen thread through a signature without once looking up. The Earl of Wellesmere waited in the street. He had offered at the first shop to come in, and Clara had said no, and he had accepted it, with a stillness that she was beginning to understand, was not coldness at all, but the particular discipline of a man who had spent 11 years being obeyed, and was having to learn at 34, in the rain, how to be useful to a woman by standing outside a door and doing nothing. The 7th bindery was in a court off Broad Street, up 3 steps, with the smell of paste in the passage. The woman who sewed the sections was named Bet Coward, and she was 60 if she was a day. And she sat at a sewing frame by the one window with her spectacles pushed up into her hair. She had been sewing books for 31 years. She used a waxed linen thread of a particular twist that she had made a study of, and when Clara sat down on the stool beside her and asked her, not as conversation, but as a question she actually wanted answered, why she waxed her own rather than buying it made up, she talked for a quarter of an hour without stopping. Clara listened. She was not being clever. She wanted to know. There was a wax she had not heard of, and a way of running the thread over the ball of the thumb that Clara's own mother had used on buttonholes, and that Clara had assumed was a thing her mother had invented, And it was not. It was a thing that women who worked with waxed thread had all been doing, apparently, in back rooms, for 200 years, without ever once being told about each other. "You sew," said the older woman. "Gowns, same hand." She pulled a thread through and drew it home. "You did not come about a prayer book." Clara set down her cup. "There is a vestry book here from St. Aldhelm's," she said. "It came in December. A gentleman paid for the binding of it himself, and was very well dressed." Her hand stopped on the frame for the first time in a quarter of an hour. She looked at Clara for a long moment over the top of the sewing. Then she took her spectacles down out of her hair and put them on and looked at her, again properly, the way one workwoman looks at another, when she is deciding something that will cost her. "That book," she said, "has been sitting on that shelf for 3 months in sheets, and the master has told me 4 times not to touch it, and there is no reason on God's earth to leave a book in sheets for 3 months. It has been paid for. It could have been done in a fortnight." She jerked her chin at the shelf behind her. "There is a paper on it, in a clerk's hand, and a note from the master in his own that says, 'Wait.' I have been sewing books in this city since before that man was born, and nobody has ever told me to wait. May I see the fortnight of the 14th of September?" "Why?" Clara told her. She told her plainly, sitting on a stool with a cup of tea going cold at her elbow, in about 90 words, without decorating any of it, a woman in 3 rooms above a milliner's shop, who had been called a liar in 3 counties for 4 months, because a clerk with a bad wig had written badly, and a well-dressed gentleman had paid to have a book wait. That coward got up and took the sheets down off the shelf, and put them on the frame in front of Clara, and said, "The 14th. You said the substitute clerk had written the entry in a poor hand and had misspelled the parish's own name. His signature was at the foot of it. Josiah Blount." Clara sat on a stool in a bindery in Bath, with a cup of tea going cold at her elbow, and looked at 4 lines of bad handwriting that made a woman a countess, and her hands were shaking, and she made them stop, and she said, Mrs. "Coward, may I ask you something further?" The Hall gave a dinner on the 12th of March. It was Lady Prudence's dinner, in the great dining room where the table sat 30, and its purpose was the announcement of the Earl of Wellesmere's engagement to Miss Sophia Lestrange, who was 22 years old, and had £11,000, and had been arranged at Lady Prudence's right hand at every dinner since November. It was to be the end of the business. The county would come, and would eat, and would understand that the Hall had closed its ranks, and the woman in Kestwick would be given her £30 a year and her old name, and the whole thing would be over before Easter. The Earl of Wellesmere had not said yes to it. He had not said no. He had been in Bath. Clara stood in the passage outside the dining room at 9 in the evening, in the best gown she owned, which was a grey silk she had made herself, and which was 6 years old, and which she had turned twice, and she was not a guest. She had come with Mrs. Purcell. Orme, who had let her in at the kitchen door, and she had in her hand a leather case with 4 leaves, of a vestry book in it, and a sworn paper from a bindery woman, and another from a curate in Walcott with a chest cold, and she was going to have to walk into a room of 30 people who had known her as the sewing woman for 7 years. The candles were lit down the whole length of the table. Somebody laughed to the season, Lady Prudence was saying. She was a milliner's assistant, and to the law, she is a claimant, and to me, I confess, she is chiefly a bore. The laughter came again, comfortable, general. The laughter of a room that has decided. Clara's hands were steady. That was the thing she noticed. 7 years of 2 shillings the day, and a dead father's debt, and 40 houses that could not have named her, and her hands were perfectly steady on the leather case, because there was nothing left in this for her to lose that she had not already counted and paid. She went in. The room turned. 30 faces, and the candlelight, and Lady Prudence with her fan halfway to her chin, and Miss Lestrange, in ice blue, at the Earl's right hand and the Earl of Wellesmere at the head of the table standing. He had been standing before Clara came in. He had been standing for some moments. "Madam," Clara said, into a silence you could have cut and hemmed. On the 14th of September at St. Aldhelm's in Bath, Edward, Earl of Wellesmere, was married by license to Charlotte Vane, in the presence of a curate named Hollis and a clerk named Josiah Blunt. The entry was made. It was made badly, by a substitute, in the vestry book. And the vestry book was sent for binding in December by a gentleman who paid for it himself. She set the leather case on the white cloth. The book has not been bound. The leaves are here. The fan did not move. "You are the sewing woman," said Lady Prudence. And the Earl of Wellesmere crossed the room. He did it in 6 strides down the length of that table, past his aunt and past Miss Lestrange in ice blue, and past 30 people holding their forks, and the room made no sound at all, and he stopped in front of Clara Fenn, and he did not look at the case on the table. He offered his hand. Clara looked at it. The scar through his eyebrow. The stillness. 11 days of a man carrying linen and standing in rain, and 11 minutes in the road at Kestwick, and her whole body had known for a month what her mind had refused to sign. She put her hand in his. "Miss Fenn is my wife," he said. "The banns are called Sunday." Nobody moved. Lady Prudence's fan came down onto the cloth. She said, "Julian." She said, "You cannot." She said, "Julian, the woman is A." And she stopped, because she had reached the word and the word was in her mouth. And she found that she could not put it into the silence of that room, with the leaves of a vestry book lying on her own tablecloth, and her nephew holding the sewing woman's hand at the head of her table. She looked at the case, she looked at her hands. She was 70 years old, and she had been right about everything for 50 of them. She said very quietly, "Was it entered?" "It was," said Clara. Lady Prudence closed her eyes. When she opened them, she looked down the table at the county, and the county looked back, and there was nothing in any of their faces that she could use. Miss Sophia Lestrange stood up. She was 22. She looked at Clara for a moment with an expression that was not hatred, and then she made a small, correct curtsy to Clara, in front of everybody, and went and sat down at the far end of the table beside her mother, and that was the end of Miss Lestrange, who married a Devonshire baronet the following year and was, by all accounts, tolerably happy. Old Mrs. Orme was standing in the service door with her apron in both hands, and tears coming straight down her face. The bishop's man came in April. Charlotte became in law what she had been since September, and took possession of the dower house at Wellesmere with a plain gold ring and a memory and a great deal else, and the county called her "Your Ladyship," and had always done so, as the county always has. Clara and Julian were married in the parish church at Wellesmere on the 3rd Sunday after Easter, by ordinary banns, in the ordinary way, with the register open on the table and the clerk sober, and the entry made in a clear hand and read back aloud twice at the bride's request, before anyone was permitted to leave the church. Lady Prudence Marchbank attended. She sat in the second pew. She had written to Clara in March 1 page, and the letter had contained no apology because she was 70 years old and made of the century she had been born into, and it had contained a request, which was that she be permitted to come, and Clara had written back 1 line saying that she would be welcome, and had meant it, because a woman who has been unseen for 7 years knows better than most what it costs to be looked at properly and found wrong. In the autumn, Clara had the study paneling taken off the east wall entire. She had it done on a Tuesday by a joiner from Kestwick, with the windows bare, because the crape had gone to the poor in January and had never been replaced. The hollow behind it was a plain plastered box, the size of a hat box, and it had held a boy's diaries for 20 years, while his father told him it was a girl's habit, and it had held the 4 lines of bad handwriting that had never got into it, and it was empty now, and Clara had the joiner leave it open. She had shelves put in it. It was exactly the right depth for a small book. The evening it was done, she came into the study at dusk, and found her husband there, with his hands in his pockets looking at it. The fire had been lit. There was snow beginning outside the windows. She had stripped a year before, the first of the year, coming down in the slow way that means it will go on all night. He had the green book in his hands. "He wrote about you," he said. Clara stopped. In September, he had a bonnet delivered to Charlotte's aunt's house on the morning, and the woman who brought it stayed a quarter of an hour to set it right. And Charlotte cried, and Edward wrote it down. He turned a leaf. He did not have your name. He wrote, "The sewing woman was kind." The snow came down. The fire moved. Clara took the green book from him and put it on the shelf in the hollow in the wall, where a boy had hidden it from his father, and she left the panel off, and she stood back, and her husband put his hand at the back of her neck the way he had wanted to since a morning in a doorway in November, and did not say anything, and neither did she. Outside, the snow went on falling on the whole of Wellsmere. On the Dower House, where Countess was reading by a fire. On the Kestwick Road, where a man had once stood 11 minutes with a cold horse. On 40 houses in this county, whose drawing rooms she knew the damp of. The book sat in the wall with the light on it. Nobody was going to hide it again.